Amen. Amen.
In 1863, President Lincoln freed the slaves, but not the country of discrimination. For 100 years, African Americans were denied equal treatment by the government body constitutionally responsible for guaranteeing it, the U.S. Congress. In 1963, in response to citizen demands and facing tremendous opposition from Southern Democrats, a bipartisan coalition of Congress took the responsibility and did the morally right thing by passing a strong civil rights bill. On July 2, 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment was adopted in 1865, abolishing slavery. In 1868, the 14th Amendment guaranteed the newly freed slaves equal protection under the laws. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, guaranteeing the right to vote to all citizens, regardless of race. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was not against the Constitution. This gave rise to the legal understanding of separate but equal. Little had changed for many African Americans, particularly those living in the South, where city officials refused to comply when courts struck down Jim Crow laws, and where things remained separate but not equal.
Everywhere you turned, the discrimination was there. African Americans without their rights, and the state and local governments not living up to their responsibilities.
In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its decision in Brown v. Board of Education, which called for desegregation in all public schools. 1 year later, Rosa Parks' refusal to give her seat to a white man led to a bus boycott by African Americans. The early 1960s saw lunch counter sit-ins, freedom rides, and peaceful demonstrations. In 1957 and again in 1960, civil rights bills were passed in Congress, but only after being gutted of all meaningful reforms.
Kennedy had to run for re-election in '64. He needed southern states to get re-elected. He really did not want to face this issue until he had been re-elected. But the Birmingham demonstrations changed Kennedy's mind.
The need for a national solution backed up by national legislation became abundantly clear, and public demand for change started pouring into the White House and Congress. On June 11, 1963, President Kennedy proposed what would become landmark civil rights legislation.
Nor is this a partisan issue. In a time of domestic crisis, men of goodwill and generosity should be able to unite regardless of party or politics.
The battle for civil rights moved from the streets into the halls of Congress. On June 19, 1963, President Kennedy submitted the bill to Congress. Concerned that the bill would not survive a Senate filibuster, he reached out to Republican Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen for support and assistance. From May to August of 1963, the House Judiciary Subcommittee held hearings and approved a strong civil rights bill. In August, thousands marched on Washington, sending a message to Congress about its responsibility to pass the legislation. Following the deadly bombing of the 16th Street Church, the national spotlight shone brighter on the moral responsibility for the passage of the bill. In October, meetings were held at the White House with congressional Democrats and Republicans to produce a more moderate bill that was then adopted by the House Judiciary Committee. On November 20, 1963, the bill was reported out of the House Judiciary Committee and sent to the House Rules Committee for debate on the House floor. 2 days after being sworn in, President Johnson called Senator Dirksen.
I think every chance you get to say what you did like you did this morning, and let them know that you're part of this partnership and your country comes first, it'll be good too.
We have talked long enough in this country about equal rights. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is time now to write the next chapter and to write it in the books of law.
After wrestling the bill out of the hands of Howard Smith, the chairman of the House Rules Committee and a Southern Democrat, debate ended and the House voted 290 to 130 to pass the bill on February 10, 1964.
There's a recognition by both parties that it was time for this to happen. So it did.
Bobby,
Hi, Mr. President.
congratulations.
Yeah, it was very nice, wasn't it?
I thought it was wonderful. 290 to 130, you can't do better than that.
No, I would think that put a lot of pressure on them in the Senate, wouldn't you?
On February 26, 1964, the House bill was placed directly on the Senate calendar, bypassing the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was known as the graveyard for civil rights legislation after having killed 121 consecutive civil rights bills from 1953 to 1963, and chaired by James Eastland, a Democrat from Mississippi. After keeping the bill out of the Senate Judiciary Committee, on March 9th, the bill went to the floor on a motion to consider, and Southern Democrats started to filibuster the motion.
There were those few who were against it, Republican or Democrat, who really did it on the basis of states' rights.
On March 25, 1964, the filibuster on the motion to consider the bill ended, having received the requisite 67 votes for cloture. On March 30th, the second filibuster began, this time on the merits of the bill.
It is also encouraging to see the type of bipartisan support that the bill is getting.
On May 5, 1964, Democratic floor manager Hubert Humphrey began negotiations with Senator Dirksen to get the votes of his less committed Republican colleagues. After lengthy negotiations behind closed doors, a bipartisan agreement was reached on May 13, 1964.
We don't want this to be a Democratic bill. We want it to be an American bill.
On June 1, 1964, Senate Democratic leader Mike Mansfield and Senate Republican leader Everett Dirksen announced they had the requisite number of votes to end the filibuster. On June 10, 1964, Senator Dirksen took the floor and announced that the civil rights legislation was an idea whose time has come.
I think Dirksen felt a powerful responsibility, that he was the person who had the votes to put this over, and in the end, he would do it.
The Senate voted 71 to 29 for cloture, 4 votes more than needed to end the longest filibuster in history, and sent the final bill to the Senate for a vote. On June 19, 1964, the Senate voted 73 to 27 to pass the Civil Rights Bill and sent it back to the House. Then, on July 2, 1964, the House passed the bill 289 to 126, and President Johnson signed it into law later that day.
It received the bipartisan support of more than 2/3 of the members of both the House and the Senate. An overwhelming majority of Republicans, as well as Democrats.
Once the bill passed, the increase in responsibility on the part of Southerners was quite striking. Overnight, blacks were admitted to what we call places of public accommodation.
Similar cloture votes were used to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Fair Housing Act of 1968.
Because of the Civil Rights Movement, because of the laws President Johnson signed, new doors of opportunity and education swung open for everybody. Not all at once, but they swung open. Not just blacks and whites, but also women and Latinos and Asians and Native Americans and gay Americans and Americans with a disability. They swung open for you, and they swung open for me.
50 years ago, our country was changed forever when Congress understood the role it needed to play. Across both sides of the aisle, Congress did the right thing and recognized its moral responsibility to work together to pass the most important law of the century. Through a process of responsible politics, an idea whose time had come was written into the books of law as the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Amen.
Free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. Well, free at last, free at last.